Welcome back to ELA Grade 6 for the week of May 4th, 2020. In this lesson, we will consider the essential question, how do the decisions we make determine our individual pathways to adulthood? Authors use figurative language, imagery, symbolism, and rhyme to develop a theme. We will read two poems, Mother to Son by Langston Hughes and The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Both are very famous American poets. This lesson will prepare you to write your own poem about an important decision you made in your life. But first, we will participate in a poetry review that will remind us of some of the poetic elements we will encounter when reading the poems and when you're writing your own poem. So let's see. I know you've had all of this before, so it's just a quick review. Figurative language is first up. It is language that is not literal. We're using fancier ways of phrasing something when we mean a certain thing. For example, the ball is in your court, meaning a decision is up to you. It does not mean an actual ball is present. Next, imagery. Words that create visual or sensory images in the reader's mind. This can make the reading much more pleasant, the more you can visualize as you're reading. Next, rhyme. Words used that are similar in sound. They often occur at the end of a line in poetry, but not always. And then we have symbolism. Something that represents something else. A picture of a heart is often used as a symbol of love. And theme, an underlying message or idea the author wants the reader to think about. So those are just some of the pieces that are in poems, and these are ones that we're going to be considering as we move along. Now we will get into our poems. As you read and listen to each poem, determine the decisions being made in each one. Think about the essential question. How do the decisions we make determine our individual pathways to adulthood? As you read and listen, think about how each author uses poetic elements to impact the reader. Our first poet is Langston Hughes, and he wrote from 1926 to 1967. In that time, he wrote more than 60 books, including poems, novels, short stories, plays, children's poetry, musicals, operas, and autobiographies. He was the first African American to support himself as a writer, and he wrote from his own experience. The poem that we will be reading that he wrote is entitled Mother to Son, and this is one of his most popular poems. Please follow along while I read aloud. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It had tacks in it and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I's been a climbin' on, and reachin' landin's, and turnin' corners, and sometimes goin' in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you set down on the steps, 'cause you find it's kinder hard. Don't you fall now, for I's a still goin', honey, I's a still climbin', and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. So that's a very beautiful poem. A lot in there. So we'll just do a real brief analysis of this poem and consider some of the things that we've talked about. For example, Mother to Son is a free verse poem which does not follow any rhyme scheme and stanza pattern. If you notice, it's just all written in one chunk. And there's not a lot of rhyming. But there is repetition in the line, life for me ain't been no crystal stair, which has created kind of a musical quality in the poem. The staircase also symbolizes life's hardships. There is a good amount of imagery as well when describing the staircase, such as it's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor. So that really helps us visualize some of her experiences. Hardships, hope, and courage are some of the major themes of the poem. The poem explores the dignity and determination of a person when facing problems. The speaker compares her life to a ragged staircase and conjures up an idea that one should not give up. She says that life is full of tests, challenges, and confusion, and a person should confront these with courage and determination. Throughout the poem, she instructs her son to continue his struggle with patience, resilience, and hope, giving her own life's example. Our next poet is Robert Frost. He is considered one of the outstanding American poets of the 20th century. He was born in California and moved with his family to New England where he was when he was 11 and where he spent most of his life. His first poem was published in 1894. Frost drew inspiration for much of his poetry from New England life and the countryside where he grew up and lived. He was honored with many awards throughout his life, including 4 Pulitzer Prizes. The poem we're going to be reading of his is entitled The Road Not Taken, also a very popular poem. Please follow along while I read aloud. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So, as you can tell, the structure of this poem is very different than Mother to Son. And we'll do a chart analysis of this that I've already completed for you. So, when we look for figurative language, we can find some personification in stanza 2, line 3, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Whoop, right here, because it was grassy and wanted wear. That makes you think that this has some sort of human quality in the woods, like it wanted wear, which doesn't really happen, does it? There is also imagery in the poem. In the first line of the poem, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. I immediately think and picture a wooded area with probably a dirt road through the woods. And when it says yellow wood, I'm imagining yellow leaves. Maybe it's the beginning of fall. And symbolism in lines 16 through 20, choosing between 2 roads, symbolizes something the speaker must make a choice between in his life. So we're going through quite a these. Yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted I should ever come back. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. Rhyme. The whole poem follows ABAAB rhyme scheme. There are 4 beats per line. The rhymes are end rhymes, which are also perfect rhymes. And I hope you could gather that as we went through. Let's just take a look at one of them. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So you can hear kind of the rhythm and the rhyme scheme after reading through that. And theme, remember that's what we were looking for here. The poem really has uncertainty and the perplexing situation of the minds of people about what they may face when standing on the verge of making choices. It is because life is full of choices, and the choices we make define the whole course of our lives. So, what decision was made in the poem? This is really about life from the perspective of a young man who decides to seize the day and as an individual chooses the road less traveled by. Though there is some regret over his choice, he realizes that the things he has encountered and the places he has visited because of this path have made all the difference in his life. And we see that the very end here made all the difference. So that's a little bit deeper analysis of this particular poem. Now, consider everything that you've learned about poetry and making an important decision. Then, if needed, review the resources in your packet, analyze structure. You want to think of what type of poem you want to write. Do you want it to be free verse, like Mother to Son? Or do you want it to be more structured and have a rhyme scheme, as in The Road Not Taken? You may also want to review determine theme. This is also in your packet because theme can be is very important, and that's something you definitely want to develop as you write your poem. And now it's your time to write your own poem. So you are ready. And just in closing, I kind of like this quote. I'll leave you with this. A great poem can move you, shake you, and remind you what it is to be human. So keep that in mind as you're writing and come up with something really fabulous. And next week, we will be stating a claim. So I think you've done a little bit of that earlier this year, but we'll be delving into that a little bit more next week. Until then, please stay safe, be well, and enjoy the rest of your week. Goodbye now. Hello, and welcome back to Grade 6 GT for the week of May the 4th, 2020. In this lesson, you will apply the historical approach to literary criticism. You may want to grab your print packet to be able to follow along. Take a look at this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, who lived during the time of Shakespeare. In fact, Shakespeare wrote most of his plays during her reign. This is a very famous painting of Queen Elizabeth I. It's called the Armada Portrait from 1588. What I want you to do is to look at the portrait carefully and come up with 4 important details that you notice about this painting. And I'm going to give you 5 seconds. 4 details, 5 seconds. Ready? Go. Okay, 5 seconds goes fast according to my timer. That's it. And I know you were all able to come up with many great details. But here is a brief summary that an art critic noticed about this portrait from 500 years ago. And that's kind of what you were doing when you were looking for details in the portrait. First of all, she is wearing very fancy clothing. Notice the pearls and beautiful dress. This is certainly nothing that we wear today, unless, of course, we're going to a Halloween party or perhaps a Renaissance festival. Her hand is also on the globe, and there's a crown on the left, which symbolizes that she is in charge of much of the world. One item that I missed when I first looked at this is the mermaid on the right, which symbolizes that she is in charge of much of the ocean as well. There are some pictures, two paintings behind her. In one, she is turning away from the stormy seas where her ships won against the Spanish Armada, and on the next one, they're turning back toward the calm seas where her English ships have won. There are many other details in this painting, and I hope you located some that I did not point out. But just like an art critic, there are literary critics. And just like we critiqued the portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, we will also critique a piece of her writing. A person who examines a text closely, looking for deeper meaning and insights, is called a literary critic. There are several approaches a literary critic can take when closely examining a text. One approach is the historical approach. The historical critic believes that studying the time and place in which the author wrote the work of literature will aid readers in their understanding of the literature. The historical critic studies the author's society and culture. The historical critic is interested in the meaning the literature had in its own time, that is, when it was first published. So here are some of the questions that an historical critic asks. How does the work reflect the time in which it was written? How accurately does the story depict the time in which it is set? What historical influences help to shape the form and content of the work? And how does the story reflect or contradict the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the time in which it was written? And a couple more. What other literary works may have influenced the writer? What historical events may have influenced this writer? And how would characters and events in this story have been viewed by the writer's contemporaries? We are now going to look at an original copy of Queen Elizabeth's Tilbury speech. This speech was given on August 9th, 1588. She gave it in person, on horseback, to her troops as they prepared to face the Spanish attack. This turned out to be a great victory for England. The copy of this speech in its original form is not very clear and would be difficult to read, mostly due to the age of the document. So let's take a look at a copy of this speech, known as the Tilbury speech, probably Queen Elizabeth I's most famous speech, in a more readable format. Please follow along as I read the speech aloud, keeping in mind some of those questions. My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom, my people, my honor, and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and I think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. To which rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already, for your forwardness, you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, in the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid you. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject. Not doubting but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people. So that is a very powerful speech, and it wasn't all that long either. So we're going to consider some questions now about this speech. Questions that a literary critic using the historical approach to literary criticism might consider. So, what does her speech tell us about her attitudes? What historical and cultural ideas seem to influence her viewpoints? How might her troops and subjects have received the speech? And how do their attitudes differ from the attitudes of many people today? So, I'm sure you noticed, and especially I stumbled over a couple words myself, with the different way that people spoke back then. So it makes it a little bit more challenging to interpret, but we're going to do our best. So, considering these questions, let's go back to the speech. When we think about what is her attitude toward her life, here in the very beginning, she begins with the cultural idea that all of her people, her subjects, love her and are devoted to her. Okay. Our safety, she is using the word royal we, the idea that she represents all of England. And her attitude is that she trusts her subjects to defend her. Okay? She doesn't want to distrust them here. In the next section, she contrasts herself with a tyrant and repeats that she trusts her subjects. She has placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. So she is resolving that she's giving total trust to her troops here, which is very important. The next section, she talks about herself as a woman, but she is also has the heart and stomach of a king, of a true king. She's willing to sacrifice herself for her kingdom and subjects. And she uses strong imagery such as her blood in the dust of battle. Her troops and subjects may have been moved by this offer of sacrifice. And in the last section, here she acknowledges that the troops will be paid for their bravery and virtue. And I think of one of the questions about how might her troops and subjects have received the speech. I thought it was kind of interesting, and I didn't really have a good answer about what was going on with the troops back then. So I did a little digging, a little bit of research, and found that they were actually very poor, poorly fed, and didn't have much medical help at all. So I'm wondering, just how thrilled they were about all this. And that was probably most likely the reason that she went out to the battlefields, which was a very unusual, especially for a queen in that time, to go out to the battlefields and meet with her troops face to face. So she is saying they will be paid. And she also uses the value of trust, faith, nationalism, and material reward to convince the troops to defend their homeland. So, all of this wording in here, I assure you, on a word of a prince, you will be duly paid. My general shall be my stead. I need your obedience to my general and your valor in the field. So she's stating here that through the troops' obedience to her general and their courage in battle, they will soon have a great victory over their enemies, the Spanish. Okay, so we've taken a nice look at the speech. We've taken a look at a portrait. And if you could just turn to show what you know in your packet and consider what you learned from the painting and Queen Elizabeth I's speech. There is also a small primary document that you may want to review as well from that time period in your packet. Pick one of the questions on the right to answer from the point of view of a historical critic. Use evidence from multiple sources to support your response. So, in other words, you're going to be using information from the text, the speech, and the painting to support your answer. So, the first question you might consider: how do the works reflect the time in which they were written? And how do the texts reflect or contradict the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the time in which they were written? So you're ready to answer one of these questions. You only have to do one. If you want to do two, that would be great too. Just remember to support your response with evidence from the text and the painting. And that's all for today. So coming up next, you're going to be looking at Shakespeare's sonnets, specifically his most famous sonnet, Sonnet 18. Thank you so much. And until then, be safe, be well, and enjoy your week. Bye bye.